Hello and welcome to this video where we're going to be looking at the question of how vulnerable are you to spiritual warfare? For 250 years, Benedict Arnold has been cussed and discussed as an unfaithful American. Why? Because during the American War for Independence, he attempted to smuggle a diagram of the fort at West Point on the Hudson River to the British Army. The succeeding generations of Americans have never forgiven him for this, and Arnold's name has entered our vocabulary as synonymous for traitor. So you wonder, why would Arnold do such a thing? What possessed one of the finest generals in the American Army to defect? Well, let me tell you another story that has surfaced that, if true, sheds light on this act. The desperate American colonies had asked the French for help in their battle with the British, and the French, glad to oblige, sent so many troops across the Atlantic that at one time the French soldiers fighting on American soil outnumbered the American troops that they were helping. General Arnold looked at this and became deeply suspicious of the French motives. Why would the French be so willing to spill so much of their own blood on behalf of Americans? Was their plan, perhaps, to help the Americans defeat the British and then make America a French colony? Was that their idea? Arnold thought so. So he wrote to Benjamin Franklin that America was going to be a colony either of Great Britain or France. If that were the case, Arnold preferred British rule. By remaining a British colony, he argued, that America would be ruled rather benevolently, and the 13 colonies might eventually be given their freedom. But if they became a French colony, they would be ruled by tyrants and would never be given independence. So Arnold argued that the American colonies should sue for peace with England. Franklin, who was ambassador to France at that time, agreed with Arnold's reasoning, but he wrote back and said that he believed that in the sovereignty of God, it would somehow all work out. Franklin strongly opposed any overtures for peace with the British. Benedict Arnold, however, was not content to entrust so much to the sovereignty of God. As far as he was concerned, the way to attain the great dream of freedom for America was to help the British win. So, in an act of what Arnold would have described as deep patriotism, he attempted to turn the diagram of West Point over to the British. When that failed, he joined the British not to conquer the colonies, but as he saw it, to defeat the French and drive them off American soil. So, as this story demonstrates, warfare is not just two armies on opposite sides of a line drawn in the sand and having at it. Warfare is also diplomacy, espionage, negotiations, and maneuvering behind the scenes, which at times can have a greater impact on the outcome than fighting on the battlefront. Now, whether they know it or not, all Christians are engaged in a titanic spiritual battle, not against the forces of any earthly nation, but against the forces of darkness. Yet this battle is largely unseen and invisible, and things go on behind the scenes that we don't naturally perceive or understand. And yet these invisible acts and forces often determine spiritual victory or defeat. And we have to understand spiritual warfare if we're to emerge spiritually victorious. So let's unpack that idea a little bit. In the very place where you are right now, there are television signals, radio signals, internet signals, smartphone signals. You can't see them, hear them, touch them, taste them, or smell them, but they're there. In the same way, if you're a Christian, it's possible that there are angels and demons around where you are right now. And if so, you can't see them, hear them, touch them, taste them, or smell them, but very possibly they're there. C.S. Lewis said, "There is no neutral ground in the universe. Every square inch, every split second is claimed by God and counterclaimed by Satan." And then he said elsewhere, "There are two equal and opposite errors into which we can fall about demons. One is to disbelieve in their existence, and the other is to believe and feel an unhealthy interest in them. Many Christians are clueless about spiritual warfare. Because we can't see spiritual things, many Christians are tempted to think that it's extreme to assume that spiritual beings are waging war against us. On the other hand, at the same time, there is a swift and dramatic rise in the interest in spiritual entities. Just look at all the movies and television programs about them. And the Apostle Paul tells us in Ephesians 6 that we are all in an ongoing spiritual war. And the Apostle Peter tells us in 1 Peter 5 that we must be alert to the danger of spiritual warfare at all times. So, if we're to take the Bible at face value, the Scripture teaches us that we are in a spiritual war and teaches us how to win it. So we want to look at 3 major points to help us determine how vulnerable we might be to spiritual warfare. Number 1, Christians must recognize the reality of spiritual warfare. As we saw earlier, the Apostle Peter said, "Be of sober spirit. Be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour." 1 Peter 5:8. We need to take this warning at face value. There's no advantage to being clueless in the Christian life. NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, is a highly sophisticated early warning system for airspace around North America. It immediately detects anything that invades our airspace and is designed to give us as much advance notice as possible if any missile, drone, or airplane were to be headed our way. It's a multi-billion-dollar system that we have put in place because we believe that there are hostile forces that would do us harm if they could. Christians should do the same spiritually. We're to have our spiritual radar on high alert to the potential of the enemy attacking us in an attempt to neutralize or defeat us. Lewis said, "Every square inch in the universe and every split second of time is claimed by God and counterclaimed by Satan." So one of the most important mental shifts a Christian can make is the shift from living for the American dream to fighting the spiritual battle. Number 2, Christians have to recognize the 3 types of spiritual conflict. Let's look at them. First of all is dirty tricks, circumstantial opposition of evil spirits to God's people and will. As a powerful example, in the first chapter of the book of Job, we see Job's life being devastated. One day he was walking the earth with fabulous wealth, good health, and a large family, and virtually overnight, he lost it all. The Sabaeans attacked and took his oxen and donkeys, which were being used to farm his land, and they killed all the servants. Next, lightning killed his sheep and the shepherds. Then the Chaldeans rustled his camels and killed the camel keepers. Next, a great wind destroyed the house where his children were and killed them all. Finally, Job lost his health and ended up sitting on a garbage dump with his body covered from head to toe with excruciating boils. Now, Job had no way of knowing why the tragedies hit him. They all had a natural explanation, but the curtain of heaven is pulled back for those of us who read the account in the Bible, and we learn that all of the incidences were the result of massive spiritual war. So while the level of dirty tricks for us is not likely to be as great as it was for Job, they can seem very great to us. As we're alert to them, we can more carefully respond to them biblically. So the first strategy that Satan uses is dirty tricks. The second level of spiritual warfare is mind games. Mind games are a strategy of deception used by the devil to deceive and defeat Christians. Satan's name means deceiver. Deception is his primary strategy. He's the great trickster, the great illusionist, the great con artist, the great liar. Jesus said in John 8:44, the devil was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature because he is a liar and the father of lies. So Satan plays games with our minds to get us to believe that that which is true is false, that that which is bad is good, that that which is wrong is right. And don't underestimate these mind games. They may appear simple and obvious to see them stated so simply, but Satan is very good at them. If you're not careful, you'll be tricked into thinking something is true, which is actually false, that something which is good is actually bad, that something which is right is actually wrong. It happens all the time to unsuspecting and uncareful believers. And he's very good at it, which is why the scriptures say, "Be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might, and put on the armor of God." His strategy is the same with us as it was in the Garden of Eden with Eve, to deceive us into doubting God's character and love for us, and doubting his benevolent intentions toward us, and to prompt us to take control over our own lives. If we know Satan's mind games, we can be better prepared to resist them. So we have dirty tricks, mind games, and finally, hand-to-hand combat. Occasionally, the enemy comes out from behind his dirty tricks and mind games and will engage God's people directly in hand-to-hand combat. This is direct opposition by evil spirits to God's will and God's people. We see an example of this when Jesus was tempted by the devil in the wilderness, when Satan spoke directly to Jesus and tried to deceive him and tempt him into sinning. In another example in Scripture in Acts 16, a demon-possessed girl who could tell fortunes followed the Apostle Paul around for days, interfering with him as he ministered, and Paul finally turned to the demon and commanded it to come out of her, which it did. This is another example of hand-to-hand combat. There are many times in the Bible when we see direct confrontation with evil spirits, and such things are being seen more and more today as the light of the gospel dims in our world. Of course, one of the most frequent sources of such reports come from missionaries, often in very primitive cultures, who tell stories of direct demonic confrontations. We may not be sure, especially with dirty tricks and mind games, when something is spiritual warfare, or when it may be accounted for by other means. After all, we live in a fallen world, and bad things happen simply as a result of the world we live in. However, in the Bible, we see spiritual warfare being behind a number of life problems. We already saw that circumstantial upheaval, as in the book of Job, was related to spiritual warfare. Physical maladies. There was a lady doubled over, somebody mute, deaf, seizures we see in Scripture, all related to spiritual warfare. Mental instability in the life of King Saul, we see in 1 Samuel 16, was spiritual warfare. Faulty thinking, causing conflict and disorder, can be traced back in Scripture in James chapter 3, verses 15 through 18, to spiritual warfare. As are thoughts raised up against God, we see in 2 Corinthians 10, verses 4 and 5. Now, this isn't a complete list, but it's a list of examples from Scripture of the kinds of things that the enemy does to wreak havoc in the lives of people. And as we're alert to these possibilities, we can be better prepared to resist. And now, number 3, Christians have to use 3 types of spiritual defenses. To offset the 3 types of spiritual conflict, the Bible makes it clear that there are 3 levels of defense that we have to have in spiritual warfare. The first one is we have to be alert. You can't win a battle you don't know you're in. We have to be alert to its reality. If we aren't, we're vulnerable. If we're ignorant, careless, or unbelieving, Satan will likely neutralize us at best and badly defeat us at worst. Again, the Apostle Peter said, "Be of sober spirit. Be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." There is no advantage to being clueless in the Christian life. We have to be alert. Second, we have to put on spiritual armor. We have to fight a spiritual war with spiritual weapons. Spiritual armor is a metaphor for being spiritually prepared for spiritual warfare. The armor is found in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 14 through 17. In that passage, Paul says, "Put on the full armor of God so that you may be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil." We flip that and we see that if we don't put on the full armor of God, we will not be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. The spiritual armor that Paul refers to in this passage is taken from the armor of a Roman soldier who had 6 pieces to his armor. If all 6 pieces were in place, he was prepared and ready for a successful warfare. If he were missing a piece, he was vulnerable in warfare. So when we put on the individual pieces of armor, here's what we're doing spiritually. Number 1, the belt of truth. This means that I accept the truth of Scripture and will follow it with integrity. The breastplate of righteousness. This means I will not harbor known sin, and I will strive to be like Christ. Next, the shoes of peace. This means I believe God's promises and I count on them to be true for me. Next is the shield of faith. This means whenever I feel like doubting or sinning or quitting, I will reject those thoughts and feelings and tell myself the truth. Next, the helmet of salvation. This means I rest my hope in the future and live in this world according to the values of the next. And finally, the sword of the Spirit. This means I will use Scripture to fend off attacks of the enemy and to advance the cause of Christ. Not every Bible teacher interprets putting on these pieces of Roman armor exactly the same way when it comes to spiritual armor, but the ones that I just reviewed are common. So having put on the armor of God, we are now ready for the final step in spiritual warfare. Number 3, we resist. This means to be spiritually shrewd and not take the enemy's bait. There are 3 different passages of Scripture that tell us to resist the enemy. The first is Ephesians 6:13. It says, "Therefore, take up the full armor of God so that you will be able to resist in the evil day, and having done everything, to stand firm." The next is James 4, verses 6 through 8. It says, "God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourself, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you." And the final passage is 1 Peter 5, verses 8 and 9. "Be of sober spirit. Be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. But resist him, firm in your faith." So those are 3 passages of Scripture that tell us that our task in spiritual warfare is to resist. An image that can be helpful in strengthening one's capacity to resist the devil is the image of a fishhook. Satan may offer us something that in and of itself is not wrong, but the will of God is not giving it to us. And if so, there's a hook in it. Like a worm offered to a fish, there may be nothing wrong with the worm, but if there's a hook in it, it's dangerous. So it can be with the enemy's temptations. To strengthen our capacity to resist, picture a hook in the thing that Satan might be tempting you with, and don't take the bait. When you're fishing, you may be tempted to marvel at how foolish the fish are in that they can't tell the difference between food and bait. Yet, enemy spiritual forces must often marvel at the spiritual foolishness of some Christians who think that they can get by with flirting with danger only to get hooked by it. So don't be spiritually foolish. Don't take the enemy's bait. If you'd like to look more deeply into this subject, I invite you to visit deeperwalk.com. Deeperwalk is one word, deeperwalk.com, which is a discipleship site that includes spiritual warfare issues. And you can find helpful tools there to take you more deeply into this subject. Now, in conclusion, Frederick Buechner once wrote, "Reality can be harsh, and you shut your eyes to it at your peril. Because if you do not face up to the enemy in all his dark powers, the enemy will come up from behind you some dark day and destroy you while you're facing the other way." We're all in a spiritual war, and to be clueless about it is not an advantage. We have to accept the reality that each of us is in a spiritual war, and we have to respond in 3 ways. Number 1, be alert. You can't win a war you don't know you're in. Number 2, put on the spiritual armor. You have to fight a spiritual war with spiritual weapons. And number 3, resist. Be spiritually shrewd. Don't take the enemy's bait. Now, I look forward to seeing you next time when we'll look at the challenge of discerning God's will. Until then, remember, God is still on the throne.